These are different types of capacitors that you will find in your heating and air conditioning system. The front row here, silver in color, are run capacitors. The ones in the back here, which are dark in color, this is a start capacitor. This capacitor here is a dual start and relay, which is commonly referred to as a hard start or super boost. This is a start capacitor relay, which would work in conjunction with this capacitor. Let's talk about each one of these so you'll understand the difference. Capacitors come in usually two different shapes. One is an oval shape, and the other is round. They also come very tall and some very short. Very old style capacitors were much larger than your new style. You may pull out a capacitor that's this big, and the replacement may be this physically smaller capacitor. However, that does not determine if it is an exact replacement. What you want to look at is the ratings on a capacitor. Let's take a closer look. You will see on the front of a capacitor specific ratings. Here, notice that we have a 7.5 microfarad capacitor. That 7.5 UF is the capacitance rating of that capacitor. It also has next to it 370 volts. That is not the voltage of your unit. It is simply the voltage rating of the capacitor. Whenever you replace your capacitor in your unit, be sure that you always go back with the same capacitance rating and voltage rating. The only acceptance is that as long as you have the same microfarad rating, you can replace it with a higher volt rating. A 370 volt capacitor at 7.5 UF can be replaced with a 440 volt rating capacitor as long as it's still at a 7.5 UF. You can never replace an original 440 volt capacitor with a 370 volt. You can always go up on your voltage rating, but you can never go down. Another characteristic of capacitors is that they do hold a charge just like a battery. So when replacing a capacitor, be careful not to touch the top connections with your bare hands. Use insulated tools to remove the wires. Even though they may be discharged and won't shock you, treat it as though it would. Another style of capacitor is a dual run capacitor. A dual run capacitor has three connections at top. Looking at those connections, you'll notice that they are designated with some symbols. Here on the top left is fan, in the center is common, and on the right side is Herm. Fan would be for your outdoor condenser fan motor. C is your common connection between the two sides, and Herm stands for compressor. Compressor being a hermetic compressor, so the term Herm is used for compressor. When replacing your capacitor, always go back with the same rating of microfarads and voltage, unless of course you have a 370 volt and you go to a 440, which is acceptable. This particular capacitor runs both the fan and compressor. If your capacitor fails and only one side fails, for instance, maybe only the fan side of your capacitor fails, but the compressor side still works, still replace the full capacitor and get a new one for both. The round dual run capacitor is still the same as the other except in shape. Some manufacturers use different shapes to fit inside their units. It's perfectly fine to go from an oval to a round as long as your ratings continue to match. Notice on a dual run capacitor you have a 5/25 in this case. The number on the left, the 5, is for the fan, and the larger number on the right is for the compressor. That will always be the case. The smaller is for the fan, the larger is for the compressor. Follow the wires on your capacitor and put them back the same way as from your new one, and you'll be fine. The last capacitor we want to look at is a start capacitor. A start capacitor has a range of microfarads. In this case, it's 176 to 216 microfarads at 330 volts. When it comes to a start capacitor, always go back with the same rating. There is no substitute. Notice also that you have a resistor on some, and some you will not. But this plug right here, this is a relief plug inside the capacitor. If this capacitor fails, that plug will be blown, and a black substance will usually be found on the start capacitor. If you see that, this capacitor has failed. If you see a trace of it, that means the capacitor is failing. It would be a good idea to replace it before it leaves you in a hot summer. Anytime you replace the run capacitor for a compressor, if your unit has a start capacitor as well, it is a good idea to replace them both. Another component that will go alongside of a start capacitor is a start relay. A start relay will be wired together with your start capacitor. There are some ratings on these capacitors. Notice that it has rating this side up. Even though the terminals are on the top, they actually go in a different direction. If you look at the rating here, it says this side up. Look at your tab. That would say that this particular relay would be mounted in this position. If you look on the side, this will help you understand which direction it goes in. Some units do not have a start capacitor and relay because they do not need it. Another device you may find in your unit is what's called a super boost or a hard start kit. This is not a factory component. This is an aftermarket replacement, but it is a solid state replacement for a start capacitor and relay. Manufacturers will always recommend you go back with their start capacitor and relay. However, if your system long ago has been replaced with this component, then you can also find a replacement for it. If you can go back with a start relay and capacitor, that is recommended. Another indicator of a failed run capacitor is the top will not be flat as a new one is. It will be swollen. The entire top half may be curved up, and all these connections will be swollen with it. When you see a swollen capacitor, that is a dead giveaway for a failed capacitor. Replace it. You may find any types of these run capacitors swollen on top. Remember, a start capacitor, which is either brown or black in color and round, will not be swollen. Instead, the plug will be blown and you will have a black substance coming out of the start capacitor. Anytime you are working with electrical components, always turn the power off to your unit. Ensure that the power is turned off to your unit by using an appropriate voltage detector And always treat the circuits as if they did have electricity, even though you've turned the power off. Always use respect when working with voltage, and use all safety precautions.